In ecology, a biological interaction is the effect that a pair of organisms living together in a community have on each other. They can be either of the same species, which would be intraspecific, or of different species, which would be interspecific. It could be short term, it could be long term. It really depends upon the situation and the evolutionary history. A short term thing might be something like pollination or predation, whereas a long term interaction might be called a symbiosis. If you are looking at the organisms, basically you have positive and negative interactions, and they meet at all of these possible combinations, which you see in the picture down on the left. So predation, herbivory, parasitism, those are all negative interactions for whatever's being consumed and a positive interaction for the other. Um, Lots of pressures here to drive evolutionary change, which we'll look at more on the next slide. Something like commensalism, that is going to be a positive impact for one and a neutral for the other. For example, like a hitchhiking species, like barnacles attached to a whale, are sometimes considered commensal. Okay, it likely affects both species, if only slightly, but it's sort of hard to determine that. Mutualism, both organisms benefit. Okay, and then you have something like amensalism, where one is harmed and the other is unaffected. Sort of an example of that is, say, grass at the watering hole is trampled by the animals. The animals are not harmed by that trampling, and most likely, but the grass certainly is. Okay, you can see some examples of interactions that might fall under this category on the right. Okay, you have the cordyceps fungus with the insect. Okay, that would be parasitism, herbivory, predation sort of structures. You have algal blooms on the bottom. Okay, algal blooms, there is harm to those around them with no real impact on the algae. So that would be commensalistic. Clownfish and the anemones, positive, positive. And then you have something like the remore and the shark, which would be positive 0. So commensalistic. Predation is a major driver of evolutionary change. Something like the bombardier beetle on the top right, they develop sort of an acid spray as a defensive mechanism. Okay, other ones are going to have more attacking sort of structures. Coloration could be cryptic, so like camouflage, or aposematic, like warning coloration. Mimicry is another great example of a pressure that is driven through this process. Mullerian mimicry, Batesian mimicry, aggressive mimicry, okay, all of these things exist. Mullerian, that's when you have two or more unpalatable species or harmful species that resemble each other. Okay, Batesian, the thing on the left is actually a larva. It's a hawk moth larva, whereas on the right you have a parrot snake. Okay, so a harmless thing looks like the harmful thing. Aggressive mimicry we see over on the right. A predator might mimic the food of its prey, luring them towards it and improving foraging success. Okay, so lots of different structures there, but predation and sort of predator-prey interactions are a major evolutionary driving force of change. Another major driving force is going to be competition. So if you have two organisms that occupy the same niche at the same time, there is going to be conflict. Okay, so the fundamental niche is the entirety of the niche that they could be in, and the realized niche is where they actually are when competition and other pressures are put into place. Those things that might limit dispersal that we talked about before. That competitive behavior, okay, that is a negative interactions. Both organisms having to struggle to survive. There is a cost associated with this. So over time, we tend to see this sort of breakdown of these niches into smaller subsections, but it's all driven by competitive exclusion. Competitive exclusion. No two organisms can occupy the same niche at the same time. But if the niche is divided, like the animals here on the right have divided where they are in the trees, they're less likely to conflict for resources, which is going to be a beneficial process. So because they're not conflicting for resources, they're going through a process called resource partitioning. And this could be like temporal, it could be spatial, all sorts of different partitioning things exist. But that is going to reduce the cost and be a driving force for speciation and evolutionary change. So the sympatric population, where they overlap, that is going to be a conflict zone. And if they can alter their behavior, or in some cases, if evolution can select for traits that will divide that niche, then that competition will decline. So like the finches on the left, you had the two finches, and if they're on two different islands, they feed on the same sort of range. But over time, when they're in the same environment, they have diversified. So there has been character displacement, a physical change in their characteristics that has led to a splitting of this niche into a smaller subsection and reduced competitive pressures. Other factors that might be part of this outside of interactions are going to be things like biodiversity, species diversity, and all of those components. Species richness is the total number of different species in the community. So both of these two communities in the picture here are equally rich. They both have 4 species of tree. Species evenness is a measure of relative abundance. So basically looking at how many there are in comparison to each other, a proportionality. Okay, so community 1 is more even than community 2. Relative abundance could be broader components. There's a variety of things that are going on there, but it's representative of all individuals within the community. So there are a variety of diversity indexes, and if you take environmental science, you'll learn about several of them. But in this class, we're really just looking at one, which is Simpson's Diversity Index. And if you look this up, this isn't actually Simpson's Diversity Index formula. College Board has chosen to give you a different one. It's the Gini-Simpsons, and it doesn't really matter as far as you're concerned, but by doing the 1 minus, it makes it so that the number that is closer to 1 for this diversity is going to be more diverse, basically. So the Gini-Simpson index is a number closer to 1 indicates more diversity. Okay, so it's taking the size of the sample divided by the total population and then filling that in. We're going to practice with this in class, but that's really what you need to do. You need to know the number of the individuals in the community, and then you need to know the population size for each species, and then you can use this as an estimation of ecosystem diversity. Interactions don't have to be direct interactions. They don't have to be species A has an impact on species B. You could have indirect trophic interactions. Those indirect things, species A is having an impact on species C by way of species B. Okay, so direct things will combine together to produce those indirect effects. And there are a variety of indirect effects that can exist. But the examples that we're seeing here, we're looking at sort of the impact. Does the predator have an impact on the producer? And does the producer have an impact on the predator? Is it top down or is it bottom up? Okay, a good example of this is looking at the cleaning up of a lake. They had sort of a top-down control mechanism with fish impacting zooplankton and impacting algae. And in the polluted environment, the fish were abundant, the zooplankton were rare, and the algae was abundant. If you were to go into this system and remove the fish, okay, at least relative into a restored environment, the zooplankton will become more common, that will keep the algae under control, and you'll enter sort of a restored state. So biomanipulation takes advantage of these interconnections. And really like, okay, so the bottom-up model basically is the presence or absence of, say, nutrients controls plants, which controls the herbivore, which controls the predator. Okay, alterations in biomass would sort of propagate through the food web. Whereas the top-down control mechanism says that the predator is the primary control mechanism. Which one's right? Well, they're probably both right in different situations. Some of the structures, this one here, for example, is a trophic cascade. And so you have the crabs and the turtles and all that kind of thing. They exist within that ecosystem. They feed on the periwinkle snails. The periwinkle snails feed on the Spartina grasses. So by consuming the snails, there is a positive impact from, say, the turtles on the grasses. That would be a trophic cascade. In this case, a top-down one. Two types of organisms are often part of these trophic cascades, the keystone species and the ecosystems engineers. Keystone species are not necessarily abundant in a community, but they influence community structure by their key ecological niches. Ecosystem engineers, sometimes called foundation species, exert their influence by causing physical changes to the environment. So something like a beaver, which transforms landscapes and building dams, by altering the structure of the dynamics or systems, foundation species act as facilitators, having positive impacts on others. Could an ecosystem engineer be a keystone species? Yeah, there's nothing sort of separate them. But keystone species don't necessarily generate habitat. They have an outsized influence. How can you predict what a keystone species will be? Unfortunately, it's kind of hard, and we typically find out usually when they've been removed, and it's problematic. So what happens when things change? Well, we have ecosystems. These ecosystems exist, but the actual process of disturbance leads to alterations of an ecosystem. And studies show sort of this intermediate disturbance hypothesis that some disturbance is necessary to maximize diversity. You can see that in the graph on the left. But too much disturbance leads to a collapse of ecosystems, and that's problematic. So finding that balance is useful. Okay, and while this can be sort of a broader focus, succession is the process of change in species structure of a community over time. It could be decades, it could be millions of years, but you have two major types of succession under this model. Primary succession, you're starting with bare rock and moving forward and developing through the stages of the ecosystem. Secondary succession, there's soil, there was already something there, but something has removed it, say a forest fire. Okay, that is going to be a sort of a faster process, to be later in the stages, but it is still going to be ecosystem changed. And those systems are going to get more complex and more complicated over time, with the pioneer stage being driven by these pioneer species like lichens and grasses and bacteria. They build soil, which then can lead to the support of grasses, like more complex grasses and bushes and trees and so on. And then eventually through those several stages, you reach a climax community, something that is stable for long periods of time. Is it always going to be stable? No, things are constantly going to be changing and knocking it back into different stages, so it's more like a mosaic than it is anything else. But these non-equilibrium conditions resulting from disturbance seems to be the norm for communities. And if there is no disturbance, diversity tends to decline. Other factors that will influence diversity are including biogeography. Okay, why do some places contain more species than other? Spatial distribution has been identified as a mechanism here. So something like species richness is going to go up when there is more evapotranspiration. Why? There'll be more producers, more plants that can drive the base structure. Plants, through evapotranspiration, help produce rainfall, which is going to interconnect to those components. That's also going to relate to something like latitude and longitude and altitude. Okay, as you move towards the pole or up the mountain, you're shifting to more of a tundra environment, which is going to lead to different types of ecosystems, different types of diversity. Island space, the amount of area that is actually available, not necessarily an actual island. That species area sort of structure is something that can be useful. Larger areas offer greater diversity of habitats, more microhabitats than smaller areas. So conservation biology is focusing on protecting key areas and key taxa that can drive and promote diversity.